Belo Horizonte, Brazil was one of the forerunners in recognizing and formally integrating reclaimers into the municipal system. The reclaimers began organizing in 1987, and they had a very conflictual relationship with the state. But in 1993, the PT was elected in the municipality, and came to power with an alliance with broader social movements in the country and with an agenda of democratizing the state. And the PT came into power in the city and changed the relationship with ASMARE, the cooperative of reclaimers, and they signed a social accord, which said that reclaimers were the preferred providers of recycling services, that the state would provide them with equipment, warehouses, etc., and that they would be provided with a subsidy from the social welfare budget to the organization to build the organization's capacity. It was probably the first time in the world when a state recognized the contribution that reclaimers were already making to the waste management system and therefore said they needed financial compensation. As opposed to Bogota, it's not going to individuals, it's going to the organization, and in Pune there's a combination of that. There was support to the organization in the first 5 years, but also payment to the individuals. But for me, what was most interesting in Belo Horizonte was the institutional transformation. So what they did is they said, if we actually want to have an accord with reclaimers, we have to change the way we conceptualize waste. We must see waste not as a technical issue, as a social, political, economic, and environmental issue. And we also need to change the way we govern. So the Waste Management Department started by having a collegial board that had all of the relevant stakeholders there. Some studies that colleagues of ours have done have shown that having this collegial board to decide what system there would be for the whole city democratized the way the Waste Management Department worked, increased its regulatory capacity. We often hear about problems with regulation inside the state, and of course strengthened the cooperative and increased its profile and did a tremendous, something we haven't talked enough about, but which I will talk more about, is changing the way the reclaimers see themselves and the way they're seen by society, right? So, but the fascinating thing they did in Belo Horizonte is they started something called a social mobilization unit inside the Waste Management Department. Waste Management Departments, like water and electricity departments, are usually run by engineers. They hired sociologists, anthropologists, social workers. Our colleague Sonia Diaz was the first sociologist they hired 20 years ago. And this social mobilization unit now it started off as practice, now it's law. They are legally required to transform the way that the citizens see reclaimers and how they relate to them, to change their position in society and in the economy and in the system, and to promote recycling, to engage citizens to change themselves, okay? So what they've done, fascinatingly, they've done things like, the Brazilians, they love carnivals, so every year they used to have a pre-carnival carnival of the waste pickers. And it became one of the hottest carnivals on the Brazilian carnival circuit, and everyone wanted to come and participate. And they, together the city, together with ASMARE, helped ASMARE to create a bar and a restaurant. They're very swank, they're nice, they're cool places where you want to hang out. Part of it was to give the reclaimers new skills, but a big part of it was to create a social space where reclaimers and regular residents could sit together and know one another, right? Absolutely radical for me. That's all I want to say. I could talk a lot about Belo Horizonte, but I don't want to lose time to look at what are some of the broader conclusions about how we see the public. So what does all of this tell us? So we know, and my paper starts with a 5-page caveat, we know that utilization of informal workers is usually a key component of neoliberalization, and it's about eroding the state and eroding the rights of workers. We know that. But we're arguing in this case, perhaps it's different. And some of the reasons why it's different is A, this is something that wasn't already being done by the state, and it was being done by workers, informal workers, in very precarious, poorly paid conditions. By creating these accords and these agreements, it's creating more stability for the workers. It's creating, you heard Purnima talk about improving their working conditions. It's changing the kind of work they do, and importantly, at least in Bogota and in Pune, they're getting financially compensated, either from the state or by residents, in addition to the money that they earn by selling recyclables. So it's improved their circumstances. So this isn't a classical exploitation of their labor. And one thing I have to point out, and again, coming from the formal sector trade unions, it was very surprising to me, many reclaimers do not want to be wage earners. They do not want to be employed by the state and earn a salary. They have, and my colleagues can talk more about this, but they have tremendous freedom in controlling their labor time. And particularly for the women, this is very important. There have been some initiatives in some of these countries where they have become wage employees, but it's not, we must get rid of that assumption that this is what they want. Okay, the provision of health and education benefits to informal reclaimers in Pune, even before they had an agreement with the city, was a recognition that municipal services are not only provided by municipal employees. I think this is an important precedent, not just for other informal workers, but for privatized, subcontracted, and outsourced workers, because we often see that's one of the reasons the state wants to privatize and outsource. So if we can establish the informal workers deserve health benefits, then surely the privatized workers in the water sector, et cetera, do as well. This expansion of the understanding, so I'm arguing this is an expansion of an understanding of what constitutes a municipal service and what constitutes a municipal worker. It's not just what's provided directly by the state. This expansion of the understanding of what constitutes a municipal service was taken further in Belo Horizonte, where they not only included collection of recyclables, but transformed the very conceptualization of waste services to see, as I said, that it's social, political, economic, environmental. What would happen if we thought that way about electricity and water? Once they had reimagined the service in this way in Belo Horizonte, then, as I said, they had to transform the institutional form inside the state, and that's what I find most interesting. It's not just about creating participatory processes, it's transforming actually how we are structured inside the state. And we didn't talk much about this, but KKPKP Trade Union, Purnima and Lakshmi and a few others who were at that time based at the SMDT Women's University, where Purnima is still a lecturer, a professor. It's a women's university, they had a feminist agenda, and the whole initiative actually started because they wanted to stop the children from waste picking. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but they went to the women and they said, your children should be in school. They said, we know our children should be in school, but we don't earn enough money. Help us earn more money, and we'll send our children to school. And that's where the union came from. So they have a very explicitly feminist agenda about transforming gender relations, and Purnima can talk more about that. But this is, I'm raising this because it's very much part of how we have to reconceptualize the public. One thing that's very important in terms of expanding not just the public sector, but the public sphere, I draw on Judith Butler's concept of ontological insurrection. And Judith Butler looks at the fact that some people do not even have the right to appear in the public sphere. We see them with so much scorn and so much disdain. And reclaimers, sex workers, we can think about who these categories of people are, but we see it so strongly with reclaimers who are often called scavengers. And when you talk to a municipality and they knock on the door and say, we want to meet with you to discuss the massive financial contribution we make to your city, people look at them like they're crazy. So one of the things that's key to political organizing by reclaimers and to reaching these kind of agreements with the state is what Judith Butler calls an ontological insurrection, where first the workers need to change how they see themselves. They must give themselves dignity, and they must see themselves as workers. And Purnima can talk about the very interesting radical education processes they went through with their members to get their members to see themselves as workers. And then they usually need to fight the state in order to get the state to see them as people who can appear in the public sphere and negotiate agreements. What's fascinating about Belo Horizonte is they've now made it the legal responsibility of the waste department to join with the workers and mount that insurrection together to change how society sees them. Now, I think this is a really important transformation in the public sphere, but also in the public sector. What role should we be giving water departments, electricity departments, housing departments for changing how society sees the homeless, for changing how society sees people without electricity, etc. One of the women on the gender panel this morning was saying, people prefer to be seen as consumers than as, what was the word used? As thieves. But now what if the state took responsibility to say they're not thieves, they're people who have a right? Okay, so this role for the state. None of the municipalities transformed, the three municipalities we've spoken about, transformed the public sector and the public sphere in all of these ways. But the one thing they all had in common was that the initiatives were led by reclaimer organizations, democratic, worker-controlled organizations that explicitly sought to transform the public sector and their place within it. They had this clear agenda. And there's an important relationship between progressive transformation of the public sector and public sphere and the existence of these strong democratic organizations that are capable of analyzing the political and the economic context, understanding the particular openings, like in Colombia, that they had a constitution that gave them these human rights and a constitutional court that was open to making progressive decisions, whereas the state wasn't. Whereas in Brazil, you had the PT, which is a political party, providing a different kind of political opening. So some of the key factors affecting the different approaches in the different cities. I want to quickly run through this because we're not into having models. You can't take what they did in Cuna and do it in Bogota, but what you can do is take the precedents. And so in fact, in the Colombian court cases, because the waste pickers around the world are in this global alliance, and some of them relate to each other, the waste picker leader, the main leader in Bogota, had been to Cuna and had been to Belo Horizonte, and she told the lawyers about, and the lawyers also knew, and they drew on these examples in their litigation. So they didn't want the same model as Cuna, but they said there's precedence, and that was quite exciting. So some of the key factors affecting the different approaches in the different cities were the historical development and nature of the municipal waste management systems. In Cuna, there was no history of door-to-door collection, so there was a gap to be filled, whereas in Bogota, there was, and so there was a different political dynamic, and I can talk more about that. Obviously, the political orientation of the parties in power locally and nationally. You had the PT when it was still quite radical in Belo Horizonte in the early years, as opposed, to the right-wing oligarchy in Colombia. National policy and legislation related to waste management. We haven't spoken about this, but in Brazil, there's very progressive legislation at a national level because of national mobilization by the reclaimers. So for example, there's a law that says every federal building must give its recyclables to a waste picker co-op. So we have that kind of legislation. It strengthens the ability at the local levels. Of course, there's the strength in the nature of the broader social movements and how reclaimers relate to them. So the MNCR, the waste picker movement in Brazil, is in a strong alliance with the MST, with the Landless People's Movement. And that has affected them. KKPKP is in alliance with the Dalit movement. And Purnima was saying last night, they're developing really interesting alliances with the anti-mining movement. Because there's if you recycle, you need to take less out of the ground. So they're really thinking creatively about who their allies are. A key point that needs to be raised is the political orientation of the NGOs and the lawyers and the church groups that work with the reclaimers. SNDT came with a feminist perspective that infused a lot of what the union did. In Colombia, I have to say, the main lawyer, who's a phenomenal woman who's done a tremendous amount to support the constitutional court cases on a pro bono basis, is also quite hectically a proponent of the free market. And she opposes the remunicipalization of the service. She wants waste pickers to be there as competitors. And that has shaped the legal strategies of the movement. There's a very interesting point about the local political dynamics, because KKPKP organizes reclaimers in Pune and in the neighboring municipality of PCMC, where there's less of a history of the local government working with movements. And that, they tried to do the same model in PCMC, it failed miserably because of different local political dynamics and a number of other factors, which we can talk about. And then, of course, the last 2 points I want to highlight are the broader national policy and constitutional commitments, this neoliberal new constitutionalism in Brazil that entrenches the right to compete and the right of free enterprise. And lastly, of course, the big one, the local and national political economy and the power of formal business. And that KKPKP right now is grappling with business wanting to move in to access recyclables as primary resources dwindle. So it's one thing to say, okay, we'll pay a reclaimer to take it, or even we won't pay, the state will pay. But when the paper manufacturers come in and say, we will pay you for your used paper because we're running out of raw materials, then these broader political economy issues rise up. Yeah, and I think as Federico said, these are very exciting and innovative examples, but also the ousting of a democratically elected mayor of the capital city of a country over his efforts to remunicipalize waste. Through the collusion of the private providers together with the Inspector General just shows how incredibly difficult it is. We can have ideas, but how difficult, and we can even make change. How do we lock in that change and keep it after decades of neoliberalism which have strengthened the power of private capital and its relations with the state? And that's our job.